China in the 3rd century BCE, a land torn apart by endless war, where 7 great kingdoms battled for survival. For centuries, no one ruler had been able to control them all. But from the rugged western frontier came a state long underestimated, the Kingdom of Qin. Harsh, disciplined, and relentless, Qin would eventually rise to dominate all others. The story of the Qin dynasty begins not with its glory, but with its survival. Nestled on the western edge of the Chinese cultural sphere, Qin was once considered semi-barbaric by the central states. Yet this geographic isolation offered 2 advantages: protection from constant invasions, and the freedom to develop unique systems of governance. The foundations of Qin's rise were laid during the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE. Reforms introduced by statesman Yang around 356 BCE transformed Qin society. Land was redistributed, peasants were encouraged to farm more efficiently, and military merit replaced noble birth as the measure of rank. This legalist approach created a disciplined, meritocratic state ready for conquest. In 259 BCE, in the city of Handan, capital of the Zhao state, a boy named Yingzheng was born. His father, then a Qin prince, was living as a political hostage in Zhao, and his mother's origins were clouded in rumor. Yingzheng grew up in an atmosphere of intrigue, danger, and survival, a child forged by the fires of chaos. At only 13 years old, in 246 BCE, Yingzheng inherited the throne of Qin. Though still a teenager, he proved ruthless and calculating. By surrounding himself with strong ministers such as Li Si, Yingzheng began to shape Qin into a war machine destined to crush its rivals. His destiny would not simply be kingship, but something greater: the creation of China's first empire. What kind of culture shaped Qin's worldview? Unlike later dynasties where Confucianism flourished, Qin was guided by legalism, phagia, a philosophy that rejected moral persuasion in favor of strict laws and severe punishments. This doctrine molded Qin society into one of obedience, efficiency, and fear. Religion in the Qin era was not organized around a centralized church or sacred texts. Instead, it was rooted in ancestor worship, divination, and rituals to natural forces. The people believed in honoring their forebears through offerings, believing the spirits of the dead could influence the fate of the living. Above all was the idea of Tianming, the mandate of heaven. This ancient Zhou concept argued that rulers governed by divine approval. If they ruled justly, heaven would grant prosperity. If they failed, heaven would withdraw its mandate, and rebellion would follow. For centuries, kings had claimed this mandate. But when Yingzheng unified the land, he went further. In 221 BCE, having conquered the last rival kingdom of Qi, he proclaimed himself not simply a king but Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. By adopting the new title, Huangdi, he linked himself to the mythical sage kings of China's golden past and claimed to embody heaven's eternal order. In doing so, Qin Shi Huang elevated his rule to something beyond mortal kingship. He presented himself as the center of the cosmos, the son of heaven destined to rule forever. Cultural unification followed. The Qin court standardized the written script, ensuring that across the vast empire, officials, merchants, and scholars could communicate with a single system of characters. Rituals to mountains, rivers, and deities reinforced the emperor's cosmic legitimacy. In every sense, political, religious, and cultural, Qin Shi Huang sought not just to rule, but to embody eternity. If the soul of the Qin dynasty was legalism, its body was the most sophisticated administrative system China had yet seen. Central to Qin's philosophy of governance was the idea that human nature is selfish and unreliable. To maintain order, rulers could not depend on morality or tradition but on strict laws and severe punishments. This was the core of legalism, shaped by thinkers like Yang and Han Fei. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he wasted no time in reshaping the land into a system that served his will. Feudal lords, who had once enjoyed hereditary power, were stripped of their titles. Instead, the empire was divided into 36 commanderies, each governed by officials directly appointed by the emperor. This prevented local aristocrats from building power bases that could challenge the throne. Standardization became the hallmark of Qin administration. Currency was unified under the Banliang coin, a round bronze coin with a square hole. Weights and measures were standardized, ensuring fairness in trade. Even axle lengths of carts were regulated so that roads and ruts across the empire matched, allowing smoother travel. The small seal script, Xiaozhuan, was declared the official form of writing, binding diverse regions with a single script. Justice under Qin was harsh but effective. Punishments for crimes ranged from heavy fines and forced labor to mutilation or execution. Loyalty to the emperor was paramount, and the law made no exceptions, not even for nobles. This system created stability but also fear. By erasing local traditions and replacing them with a single imperial order, Qin Shi Huang established the blueprint for centralized power in China, one that would endure long after his dynasty collapsed. By the year 221 BCE, the last rival state of Qi had fallen. The young king of Qin, Yingzheng, stood triumphant over a land that had known only centuries of war. But for him, victory was not enough. He needed a new title, one that would capture the unprecedented scale of his achievement. Thus, he declared himself Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin. This was no ordinary kingship. By using the title Huangdi, he linked himself to the semi-divine rulers of China's mythical past, the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. His message was clear: he was not just a king among men but the eternal ruler chosen by heaven itself. Qin Shi Huang believed absolute power was essential for stability. He concentrated all authority in his own. The feudal aristocracy, which had plagued earlier dynasties with rebellion, was eliminated. Nobles were moved to the capital at Xianyang, where their influence could be monitored and controlled. His chief advisor, Li Si, became the architect of Qin's authoritarian system. Li Si enforced the principles of legalism with ruthless efficiency. Loyalty was demanded, dissent was punished, and uniformity was enforced across every aspect of society. Perhaps the most infamous event symbolizing Qin's iron grip came in 213 BCE, when the emperor ordered the burning of the books. Works of philosophy, poetry, and history that contradicted legalist doctrine were destroyed. Only practical texts, on medicine, agriculture, and divination, were spared. The following year, dissenting Confucian scholars were executed, an act remembered as the burying of the scholars, Kangru. Censorship and fear became instruments of control. In Qin's empire, history itself could be rewritten, memory reshaped to serve the emperor's vision. Beyond ideology, Qin Shi Huang also imposed physical symbols of power. At Xianyang, he ordered the construction of grand palaces, each larger than the last, designed to dwarf human scale and reflect cosmic authority. The emperor's presence was elevated to something divine. He was not merely a ruler but the living embodiment of order. This concentration of power created stability, but it was fragile. The empire rested on one man's will. And when that will faltered, the fear and resentment built into the system would soon erupt. While Qin Shi Huang's political system was rigid, his economic reforms were dynamic, designed to bind the empire together. The Qin dynasty's economy was built on agriculture, infrastructure, and standardization, turning China into a single integrated system for the first time. Agriculture was the foundation of Qin's wealth. The government prioritized farming above all else, viewing peasants as the lifeblood of the state. Taxes were collected in grain, which both fed the armies and sustained the massive workforce needed for construction projects. Major irrigation works expanded farmland. The most famous was the Dujianjian irrigation system, built around 256 BCE in Sichuan. This engineering marvel controlled flooding, provided steady water for crops, and still functions today, over 2,000 years later. By boosting food production, Qin ensured both stability and the resources for its wars of unification. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Qin's economy was its drive toward uniformity. To eliminate regional differences, currency was standardized as the Banliang coin, a round bronze piece with a square hole in the center. Its simple, practical design became a symbol of Qin authority. Weights and measures were unified across the empire, ensuring fairness in markets and trade. Even tools and farming equipment were standardized, increasing efficiency and reducing waste. These reforms transformed China into a single economic space, where goods, soldiers, and officials could move seamlessly. And the Qin also invested heavily in infrastructure. Thousands of miles of roads were built, radiating outward from the capital Xianyang like the spokes of a wheel. These roads allowed armies to move quickly, but they also facilitated trade and communication. The emperor also ordered the digging of canals, linking river systems to improve transport of grain and goods. The Lingshu Canal, constructed around 214 BCE, connected the Yangtze and Pearl River systems, opening trade routes into the south. While the Qin state prioritized farming over commerce, consistent with legalist disdain for merchants, trade nevertheless flourished under the new system. The standardized currency and roads allowed merchants to operate across regions that had once been divided by war. Salt, iron, and luxury goods like jade flowed more freely than ever before. For the first time in Chinese history, one could travel from the far south to the northern frontier and use the same coin, read the same script, and be subject to the same laws. But this prosperity came at a cost. Heavy taxation, forced labor, and relentless conscription placed immense burdens on the people. Farmers were often taken from their fields to work on colossal state projects, palaces, roads, canals, and the early Great Wall. While these projects bound the empire together, they also bred resentment. To many peasants, the Qin dynasty represented not unity and prosperity, but exhaustion and oppression. The rise of the Qin dynasty was inseparable from its military machine, one of the most formidable forces in ancient history. Long before unification, Qin was regarded as a barbaric Western state by its rivals in the Zhou and Warring States periods. Yet this outsider image gave Qin both motivation and advantage. It was less bound by tradition and more willing to innovate. By the 4th century BCE, under the reforms of Xiangyang, Qin transformed into a highly militarized society where every citizen was directly tied to military service and agricultural production. The Qin army adopted strict meritocracy. Unlike other states, where aristocratic birth determined military rank, Qin rewarded soldiers for battlefield performance. Killing enemies and taking heads could elevate a common farmer into a commander. This merit-based system created fierce loyalty and unmatched motivation within the ranks. By the time of Yingzheng, later Qin Shi Huang, the army was a disciplined, professional war machine. Qin also pioneered advanced technologies in warfare. The standardized crossbow, powerful and easy to mass-produce, allowed soldiers to strike at greater range with deadly accuracy. Their chariots were replaced by infantry and cavalry formations, making the army more flexible in diverse terrains. Siege technologies such as scaling ladders, battering rams, and tunneling methods allowed them to breach the defenses of rival states that once seemed impenetrable. The conquest campaigns between 230 and 221 BCE were swift and ruthless. Han fell first in 230 BCE, followed by Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and finally Qi in 221 BCE. Each campaign was marked not only by overwhelming force but also by psychological warfare. Qin armies were known for mass executions of prisoners, designed to instill fear in future opponents. Once the last king of Qi surrendered without a fight, Yingzheng declared himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of a unified China. This was the first time in history that the lands of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers were consolidated under one central power. Yet conquest came at a cost. The empire was built upon bloodshed and intimidation, leaving a legacy of fear that outlived its victories. The military dominance of Qin created the foundation of imperial China, but it also planted seeds of resentment among the conquered populations, who would later rebel after the emperor's death. If Qin Shi Huang's military campaigns represented his power in this world, his obsession with immortality revealed his fear of the next. Born in 259 BCE, Yingzheng had grown up during the brutal Warring States period, witnessing betrayal, assassination attempts, and the fragility of life itself. By the time he unified China in 221 BCE, he was determined not only to conquer nations but also to conquer death. The emperor surrounded himself with alchemists, magicians, and scholars who promised him eternal life. Taoist practitioners claimed that the mountains and seas hid elixirs of immortality, guarded by mystical beings. Qin Shi Huang dispatched expeditions to the eastern seas in search of the Isles of the Immortals, legendary lands where divine beings brewed potions of everlasting life. One such expedition, led by Su Fu, is said to have never returned, possibly settling in Japan instead. Ironically, the very elixirs he consumed to prolong his life may have hastened his death. Many of the immortality pills were laced with mercury and toxic minerals, common in Taoist alchemy at the time. Chronic ingestion likely damaged his body, leading to paranoia, declining health, and ultimately death in 210 BCE during a tour of his empire. His fear of death also manifested in the most ambitious tomb in human history, the mausoleum of the first emperor, guarded by the world-famous terracotta army. Discovered in 1974, the thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and chariots were crafted to serve him in the afterlife. The underground complex, still largely unexcavated, is believed to contain rivers of mercury and palatial chambers that mirror his empire. This grand project symbolized his attempt to eternalize his reign beyond mortal limits. But immortality eluded him. After his death, court officials concealed the news for weeks, transporting his decaying body back to the capital in a sealed carriage, reportedly masked by barrels of fish to hide the stench. Within 4 years, the dynasty collapsed, undone by internal rebellion and resentment. The man who had sought to escape death instead left a legacy as a cautionary tale: power and conquest cannot defeat mortality. Yet his story endures. Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality continues to fascinate historians, archaeologists, and storytellers alike. It embodies humanity's eternal struggle against the inevitable, a reminder that even the greatest emperor must bow before time. The Qin dynasty may have lasted only 15 years, 221 to 206 BCE, but its legacy shaped the course of Chinese civilization for over 2 millennia. Qin Shi Huang's vision of centralization created the very foundations of the imperial system that lasted until 1912. Political legacy: the title Huangdi, Emperor, was adopted by all later rulers of China, turning the emperor into a semi-divine figure. The centralized bureaucracy, standardized law codes, and merit-based appointments became the blueprint for governance across dynasties. Even though harsh legalism was later tempered by Confucian ethics, the administrative machinery designed by Qin endured. Cultural legacy: standardization of script allowed communication across vast territories. The small seal script became the ancestor of modern Chinese writing, binding diverse peoples under one cultural identity. Likewise, unified weights, measures, and currency laid the foundation for China's integrated economy. Infrastructure: the Great Wall's early foundations and the extensive road network linked distant regions, both militarily and economically. These innovations helped secure China's borders and facilitated the Silk Road that blossomed under later dynasties. Psychological legacy: Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality became a symbol of both ambition and hubris. His fear of death resonates with universal human anxiety, making him one of the most studied and debated rulers in history. Over centuries, Qin Shi Huang transformed from a historical emperor into a legendary figure wrapped in folklore, myths, and cautionary tales. The Isles of Immortals, stories tell of his grand fleets sailing eastward to seek magical elixirs. Some legends claim that Su Fu, his envoy, reached Japan and introduced Chinese knowledge there. In Japanese folklore, Su Fu is remembered as a cultural hero, blending myth with history. The Mercury Rivers, ancient chronicles like records of the grand historian, Shiji, describe Qin Shi Huang's tomb as a microcosm of his empire, with rivers of flowing mercury representing the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. Modern soil surveys have indeed found abnormal levels of mercury near the mausoleum, blurring the line between legend and truth. The Cursed Emperor: folk tales speak of heaven's anger at Qin's tyranny. Lightning storms, strange comets, and natural disasters during his reign were interpreted as cosmic warnings. Some stories suggest that his obsession with immortality angered the gods, who ensured his premature death. The Eternal Army: villagers near Shi and told stories for centuries of clay men buried underground before the terracotta army's discovery in 1974. Some even spoke of spirits guarding the emperor's tomb. When archaeologists finally unearthed the site, oral tradition proved to have preserved a fragment of truth. The emperor's ghost: in Chinese ghost stories, Qin Shi Huang is sometimes depicted as a restless spirit wandering the world, punished for his cruelty, forever searching for the immortality that eluded him. These tales are retold in operas, novels, and folk performances, keeping his memory alive.